So what is ludomusicology? What is this big word that we throw around? I made a video about this a couple years ago when I first started teaching this class, but it's a very young field. It changes very fast, so I thought we were due for an update. I also kind of sound like I'm asleep in some of those old lecture videos, so I'm trying to go through and remake them with a little bit more energy. So now I'm awake, I've got some coffee, let's dive right in. Ludomusicology. Let's start by breaking down the word. You can sort of see it in three parts. Music, I'll assume, is self-explanatory, though of course music itself is actually a very complicated topic. Ology is a Greek suffix, means the study of. So you see this in, zoology, biology, archaeology, the study of. And then finally, ludo is a Latin verb. I play, ludo, ludere, play. Or it also can be found in the noun ludus, which is the word for game. So ludomusicology, the study of game music. So ludomusicology is a very young field. The word ludomusicology was coined by Guillaume Laroche, a Canadian researcher, in the year 2007. So not that long ago, positively youthful in the scheme of academic fields. And ludomusicology then sort of developed over the next several years and is now, I would say, a thriving, healthy, but still very much growing field of study. There are several major steps in sort of the development of ludomusicology as a field, which I'll sketch out here. The first one of those, I would say, is the founding of the Ludomusicology Research Group, which you can find to this day at ludomusicology.org. This is a group of scholars mostly based in the UK and Germany and around Europe that started to hold conferences, started to collaborate amongst themselves, and remain very, very active in the field and in pushing the field forwards. On this side of the pond, we've got the lovely acronym NACVGM, which is sometimes pronounced that way, or you can just say NACVGM, the North American Conference on Video Game Music. And so NACVGM started in 2014, so about 10 years ago now. They held their first conference at Youngstown State. So again, very young for an academic field. There are other sort of international groups. I know there's an Australian Society for Ludomusicology. You find ludomusicology practiced in universities all around, particularly, not only North America and Europe, but in Scandinavia and South America and Australia and Asia. It's really an international field at this point. Sort of bringing the different groups together is this acronym with a lot of S's in it, the Society for the Study of Sound and Music in Games, the SSSMG, is a sort of umbrella organization that a lot of these people belong to, contribute to, and sort of the most notable contribution of this organization is the founding of the Journal of Sound and Music in Games, or JSMG. We'll write that out, Journal of Sound and Music in Games. And this is the first peer-reviewed journal dedicated to the study of video game music and video game sound. I would say personally I see a lot more study of music happening in this field. Video game sound is to some degree related to video game music, but to some degree separate. And I think that it's safe to say that you see a lot more scholars still studying the musical aspects, although this does go sometimes hand in hand with sound, as we'll see in this class. Sometimes they're very closely related to each other, and you definitely can still find studies and papers that are concerned mostly with sound design or environmental sounds and things like that. Really, games, just like films, you kind of have to look at them as a full soundscape that incorporates not only music, but sound effects, dialogue, interface sound effects and things like that. We'll look at some articles later in the course that kind of break down how to analyze how all of these things go together as one. But JSMG, which started around 2020, is a really major sort of event in ludomusicology as well, because it really is, as I said, the first academic journal that's devoted to the study of sound and music in games. And before this point, there was not as clear a place where to send your research. Ludomusicology really got its start through some sort of edited collections of essays. There's one from 2014 that we all call the Pink Book. I think it's just called Music in Video Games. But it has several kind of landmark studies in it. It was edited by several big people in the field. And, a series of books like that have come out, and studies of video game music would pop up in regular journals from time to time, or in monographs, which are scholarly books written by one person. But JSMG was a really big deal because it's the first peer-reviewed venue for research articles that comes out 4 times a year. So it's really kind of increased exponentially the number of articles coming out about video game music in the past few years, which is a really awesome contribution and a really worthy update to the original version of this video. Next, let's think about the disciplinary approaches that we find when we study video game music. Now, ludomusicology, for the most part, grows out of some of the traditional disciplines that we find within music studies already. You can sort of divide music studies up into theory and analysis. That's my own corner of the field in general. We would talk about historical musicology, and we talk about ethnomusicology, which is broadly speaking sort of the anthropology of music, the study of world musical cultures. This is a very traditional subdivision of the field with these 3 big branches. There's also composition along with that, although that's not quite in the music studies and the critical music space. But theory and analysis, how music theory applies to video game music, particularly analyzing various soundtracks. There are lots of scholars who apply theoretical concepts or sort of extract new theoretical concepts out of game soundtracks. That's a major side of the field. Musicology, often historical in orientation, or sometimes sort of critical or theoretical musicology that's interested in critical theories and philosophy and media studies, kind of the interdisciplinary mainstream of musicology and the cultural study of music. You find lots of work here that falls into this area. There's historical work on video games, sort of talking about how video game music fits into culture. There are great books like Will Gibbons's Unlimited Replays, almost forgot the title, Will Gibbons' Unlimited Replay, all about the presence of classical music culture in video game music. Then finally beyond that, ethnomusicology, if we look at sort of broadly world musical cultures, or the anthropology of music is one way to understand this category. In traditional ethnomusicology, this is often studying the music of other cultures, say studying African music, studying East Asian music, studying South Asian music, Indian music. India has lots of different musical traditions. Or, even studying folk music, studying things that are sort of outside of the American, European, classical and popular traditions, generally falls into ethnomusicology. They interact with the games. If we drill down even more specifically, we can find a few, characteristic disciplinary trends that sort of are a little bit more specific to video games. And, the first thing that I'll say is, building off of that Guitar Hero notion, is that Guitar Hero and games like that were one of the ways that ludomusicology really launched itself. So within these subdivisions of music theory and analysis, historical musicology, and ethnomusicology, there are also more specific categories that you'll tend to find are really significant within ludomusicology. So the first of these I'm going to call organology. Organology is a subdivision of musicology that is the study of instruments, organs being one instrument, but more generally, the study of how people interact with instruments, how instruments are designed and built, how they shape music making, how they reflect cultures. And this is one of the ways that ludomusicology really got started. The connection between, say, music making games like Guitar Hero, where you actually have plastic guitars as your controllers, things like this offered scholars sort of a way in to video game music. When you had something that really resembles real music making, you can draw this really direct connection between traditional musicology and ludomusicology as a budding discipline. So that was one of the really big early trends. Kiri Miller has an important book about this called Playing Along that we'll read some of. There were several other articles on sort of the phenomenon of the guitar controller and interacting with music and the notation systems that they use and all of that kind of stuff that sort of groups under the more traditional category of organology. Another major aspect of this is the study of interactivity. Obviously, games as a medium are interactive. They respond to what you do. They might go different ways depending on whether you succeed or fail. A lot of games give you free choice about what to do, whether it's an open world game where you get to choose where to go, whether it's a game with a branching storyline or a sort of an open selection of menu or levels or anything like that. Games have to respond in certain ways. And there are all kinds of studies of how game composers deal with this, of how the player experience might be shaped by interactive music. It's something that fundamentally makes video game music different from film music, classical symphonies, pop songs. None of those are really interactive. And in fact, in film, for instance, things are really tightly mapped on. A film soundtrack is supposed to directly match the action. And games offer certain ways to do that, but also certain ways in which you can't have tightly crafted, tightly edited soundtracks because one player might do this segment faster or slower than another player. So you have to interact in certain ways, but there are also other ways in which you can't really interact. So there's a big body of ludomusicological scholarship that looks at how games treat interactivity and how composers treat interactivity and how we as scholars understand and cope with studying a medium that can be different things to different people, or it can be different in each playthrough. So a lot of challenges there, and a lot of ludomusicology scholarship addresses this directly. Another major trend that you sort of find in ludomusicology is studies of pedagogy, which just means education, teaching. How do we teach our students about video game music? There are not that many classes on video game music. Here at Gettysburg, I won't say we had the first, we certainly didn't, but when I started teaching this class in 2018, there were not a ton of courses on video game music at traditional colleges and universities. There are many more now, but there's still not, you don't find them at every single school. And the ways in which we teach people about video game music are still kind of in process. So you find a lot of studies about, here's how you structure a 100 level course like this one. Here's how you structure a class on video game music composition. Here's how video game music interacts with other titles. How does it interact with a computer science department? How does it interact with a business department? How can we sort of bring methods from one discipline into the other? So there are lots of studies out there about, kind of how to teach video game music and how to best help our students to understand it. I mentioned before the cultural study of music, but within this, in ludomusicology in particular, there are all kinds of ways in which this is relevant. People have done studies about how video game music, helps to express identity in all sorts of ways. And here we're talking about not only music within games. There are studies such as Thomas Yee is writing a book about music and exoticism within video games, how games represent, whether accurately or whether sort of inaccurately and stereotypically, how games represent other cultures. Sometimes these representations are authentic, sometimes they're more problematic. So there are lots of studies out there if you're interested in how do games sort of musically depict the Middle East or Africa or, imagined civilizations. What tropes do they draw upon to sort of represent this? There are also studies of how game music and game sound represent identities sort of outside of games, communities of game music fans, for instance, how people identify with soundtracks, how people, sort of create their own tribute music or cover songs and things like that. We'll have a unit on that in this class. Game music, as an aspect of the game enthusiast community, is often held up as a big thing that people kind of rally around. So game music as an identity formation tool is also something that I would say is broadly within the cultural study of music and takes these sort of specific forms within ludomusicology. When we talk about game music, we're also often really talking directly about the technology. As we'll learn in the second week of this class, game music's technical history is pretty well documented, but it's also really, really closely tied into the styles of game music that were written, the ways that game music and game sound were used. The development of style, the development of game design, the development of music, and the development of the technology all are really, really tightly knit together. So game music scholars will draw a lot on the history of technology. They'll often talk about how these technologies directly influenced the music that was made or directly influenced how people listened to it. So there are a lot of studies within ludomusicology that are looking at technical things alongside cultural or stylistic, and that's also something that I think is fairly unique to ludomusicology and is a very important part of it, that we're thinking about how the technology makes the music happen. And then finally, I'll say that there's a lot of work out there on the composition of game music. Just like when I was talking about interactivity a moment ago, it's a really significant aspect of game music that it often has to be flexible. It often has to serve different purposes. It might be extremely diverse, to sort of underscore different sides of a game. It'll include things like menu screens that are not, the gameplay. They sort of require different compositional approaches. You have to think in creative ways. So there are a lot of like I said, pedagogical things, but also, advice from composers and just sort of analytical studies of how this music is actually written and is actually composed. And there's sort of a lot to learn from what the composers themselves will do in order to write a soundtrack. And I think that ludomusicology also benefits from the fact that the video game music community tends to be a really welcoming, really dynamic space where a lot of scholars actually have the opportunity to talk to or to interview these game composers. There are lots of well-known professional game composers who are more accessible than your average, Hollywood film composer. You can't really talk to Hans Zimmer, but you can talk to a lot of game composers and sort of learn from them. And, they actively participate in this stuff. They give keynote addresses at the annual ludomusicology conferences. So there's sort of a lot more interaction within ludomusicology with the people who are actually making the music. And that can sort of lend an interesting layer to scholarly studies of game music.